It's the only city in Florida where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested, and the stories he left behind in St. Augustine continue to resonate more than 55 years after his assassination. I'm joined now by some of the people who are best equipped to remember and share that history. Adonnica Toler, exhibit designer, historian, museum director at the Eartha M.M. White Museum in downtown Jacksonville. Welcome, Adonnica.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. Jessica Clark, St. Augustine Bureau reporter and anchor at First Coast News. Welcome, Jessica.
Good morning.
And David Nolan, author and historian, and arguably the most knowledgeable person around when it comes to St. Augustine's civil rights era. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. And to our listeners, what were you taught about Dr. King's involvement in St. Augustine's civil rights movement? And what questions do you have? Give us a call at 549-2937. Email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can message us on Facebook and Instagram or tag us on X at FCC On Air. Jessica Clark, over the past decade, you've done so much reporting on St. Augustine, MLK in St. Augustine. Do you find that most people are aware of his role in the civil rights movement, or does it kind of remain a well-kept secret?
I think people in St. Augustine know. Not all of them, but I think people who have lived here for a while in St. Augustine know. But beyond that, I don't think many people do know how much took place in St. Augustine when it comes to the civil rights movement. It was pivotal.
And telling that story, because, you know, in the world of television, you don't always have a ton of time. So there's so many facets to this story. How do you tackle, what to get to, how to best lay out the many stories and facets of that?
Well, you find the people who remember, when Dr. King was there, but also in the year leading up to Dr. King coming in. So that was 1963. He came in 1964. And there are still people around who remember him being in town or have heard stories from their parents about him being in town and what took place there. So getting the eyewitness accounts, or almost eyewitness accounts, so critical. But then also finding the places, because the visuals, at least for TV, are important. So if you can say it was at that house where Dr. King was almost shot, or it was at that house where Dr. King stayed the night, but then he was moved off swiftly for security reasons. So having the visuals there, too, are important, especially if they're being preserved or if they're being considered for demolition. So those are, for me, kind of the stories and what I'm looking for when I'm trying to paint the history of what happened there.
And there are some of those sites we'll probably get to a little bit later in the program. But Adonnica, we were talking about Martin Luther King's role in St. Augustine, but you as a historian of many things in Jacksonville were saying that he worked here quite a bit too.
Yes. He actually, when he arrived, he did some of his secret planning here in Jacksonville as they were trying to do the different works in St. Augustine. So he did go by the Clara White Mission. He worked with Dr. Eartha White. He also was on the Ashley Street, which was on Ashley Street. So he ate at Perks, which is a restaurant that was on Ashley Street. But he worked with Isaiah Singleton and Mary Singleton. He met at their home as one of the meeting places. And he also met with Frank in the home of Frank Hampton. And, Frank Hampton was key in challenging the golf course for blacks to be able to play at the golf course. So he had a presence here, and he had, there were people here, and I also should say, Earl Johnson Sr. was his attorney when he had to defend him here at our courthouse. So he was arrested in St. Augustine, but he was tried here in Jacksonville. And Earl Johnson Sr. was his attorney. And then Earl Johnson Sr. ended up being the first, being part of city council president, first black city council president.
David Nolan, I would argue that you've done more than any single person in St. Augustine to broadcast and commemorate the civil rights struggle there. We actually have a little sound from Martin Luther King speaking about his time in St. Augustine. Let's hear a little of that first.
The Negroes of St. Augustine, Florida, and those that have come in from other communities and their allies in the white community are determined to march the streets of this city until the walls of segregation come crumbling down.
David, how central was King to changing the course of history as we know it?
Oh, it was just tremendous. And you know, the funny thing is, when he first spoke in St. Augustine, so many people wanted to hear him that no single church was large enough. So what they did was they held rallies simultaneously at St. Paul AME Church on what's now appropriately Martin Luther King Avenue, and around the corner on St. Francis Street at the First Baptist Church. And they shuttled Dr. King out the back door of one church and in the back door of the other, so everybody would have a chance to hear him. And you still have some people in town who can say, "Oh, I heard him at St. Paul's," or "Oh, I heard him at First Baptist." So, you know, but it was just a tremendous thing for Dr. King to come. It made St. Augustine kind of a stage for a great moral drama with an international audience. And those months in early 1964 up until July 1964, St. Augustine got more publicity than it had gotten in the 399 years before.
And talk a little bit about that publicity, because if you look back, for instance, at the local publications, there wasn't a lot of coverage of what was happening in St. Augustine, but other outlets were coming to town and giving it a fair amount of publicity.
In huge numbers. And we've met, you know, some of the television and newspaper reporters over the years. A lot of them have passed away. But the local paper decided it would not run photographs of the civil rights movement after a certain point because they didn't want to encourage them. And they were very partisan in opposition to Dr. King at the time, and they've made up for it, I think, in generations since then. But it was a very touchy thing to be somebody with a camera around your neck, and the major television networks hired bodyguards for their television people because it was very expensive to replace the cameras that got smashed then. And people who opposed civil rights didn't want word of what was happening in St. Augustine to get out to the rest of the world.
And the protests in St. Augustine, Jessica, were very violent, very scary. But, I mean, just in the last couple of years, the controversy over the monument removal, the Confederate monument removal in St. Augustine was also really quite scary, also got violent.
It did get violent. I don't think to the extent, of course, as what we saw in the 1960s. But it was interesting then to, after interviewing people who had participated in the demonstrations in the 1960s, in the years leading up to 2020, and then in 2020, going back to them and asking, does anything look similar to what you saw in the 1960s here? And they were saying it is like a mirror image, because it was young people, a lot of young people, who were demonstrating. They were walking around the plaza. They were walking down King Street, which is also where demonstrators had walked in the 1960s. And so, yeah, it was similar. There was some violence in 2020. There was not a lot, thank goodness.
One of the leaders of the movement, who came to monitor the movement, Adonnica, was Andrew Young. He also was badly beaten by protesters, viciously beaten. He went on to become, of course, a U.S. congressman and the UN ambassador, an ambassador to the United Nations. And he's been interviewed since then. I actually want to go to some sound that he had, because he recounted how he was originally sent to St. Augustine to quell the local protests.
It doesn't matter what is happening in Washington. Something is happening in St. Augustine. People are determined to be free, and they're going to be free whether Washington says it's all right or not. And I came in to tell the people that the march was over, that we were going to have to be patient and trust our government.
Now, he said later that he felt like he became a man, an adult, when he was in St. Augustine, that was just such a transformational experience for him. But obviously, his attempt to come to town and sort of rein in what was happening in St. Augustine didn't work.
Didn't work at all. Because by then, everyone was ready. It was ready for the change. And also, what people don't realize, also here, the leaders here in Jacksonville was working with those in St. Augustine. So it was a point that it was just everybody was ready for a change. It was just time to change. I'm tired of waiting, so it's time for me to take a stand. And the leadership here in Jacksonville with Rutledge Pearson and Johnson and Earl Johnson and such, and the youth council, the NWC Youth Council with Rodney Hurst and others like him. It was this time they actually by this time that Young was coming to St. Augustine, those in Jacksonville, the young people in Jacksonville, had kind of taken over. They were staging their own protests with their parents having to come get them, or Rutledge Pierce and them having to come get them, but they were tired. I've talked to some who said their parents asked them, "Why are you doing that?" And they said, "We're tired, Dad. I don't want to live like this, and so I'm going to go out there." So parents were often going to go pick up their children, and so when Andrew Young came and say, "Oh, you just have to wait," that was long gone. They were past that. There was time for me, time for us to take a stand and get my place as an American citizen. And so for him to come and say that at first, I think it just calm it down, but it was too far gone, too organized, too much activity happening, too much collaboration for him to just say, go home and sit down.
And clearly that, David, it didn't happen. And he then sort of took the reins and moved ahead with Dr. King.
He did. Andy tells the story that he got tricked into it. He said he walked into a church all prepared to tell people we're not going to march anymore. And Hosea Williams up front said, and here's Reverend Andrew Young who's going to lead the march tonight. So it was an experience for Andy. It was a great learning experience for everybody. We had a visit last week from Al Lingo, who was one of the people who jumped in the Monson swimming pool when the acid was poured. And Al was a young man then. He's 87 years old now on a heavy cane. And he came down to visit Mrs. Cora Tyson, who put up Dr. King. And Mrs. Tyson just turned 100 last year. So between them, they had 187 years sitting in Dr. Haling's old dental office, which was a headquarters for the movement back then, and reminiscing about old times. I mean, this is history. As a historian, I just love to hear it directly in my ears and not have to read it on old pieces of paper.
And remind us about that incident, the acid in the pool. It's a photograph that a lot of people will be able to visualize when you remind us about it.
It's the most famous photograph ever taken in St. Augustine. I mean, there were so many. I always credit the leaders of the civil rights movement as people who should have won every Oscar, Emmy, and Tony Award there is, because they had a perfect sense of how to dramatize what was wrong with the old way of doing things. And so Henry Twine, who was my great teacher in this, said, we were not fools. We knew if you did something one day, it'd be on the front page of the paper. If you did it the next day, it'd be on the back page of the paper. And if you did it a third time, it wouldn't be in the paper at all. So he said we had a strategy meeting every night to see what could be done that would be slightly different. And one day somebody said, well, the Monson's Motel, which was the focal point for demonstrations, they have this little swimming pool. So why don't we have a swim in? And he said, everybody said, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. He said, but then as we got ready to leave, we looked around and we realized that nobody in that room knew how to swim. So we were not about to jump in the pool not knowing how to swim, but Hosea Williams, who was, they call him King's kamikaze, said, I know some black people in Georgia who know how to swim. I'll send for them. And what they did was they had these black people come from Albany, Georgia, and they had two white civil rights workers, one of whom was Al Lingo, come down, and they could register at the Monson Motel as guests. And there was this legal fiction then. If you were a guest at a motel, you could have company come in. And so he said this was the plan. Think of it. You had these two white guys looking out the crack in the door, waiting for a car to come up and disgorge several black people in bathing suits. And they would all run to the pool and jump in together, and the whites would say, it's okay. They're our guests. They're our guests. So that was how it was to go. And he said, even at that, we got scared. There was so much violence. We said, those people may be dead before they ever hit the water. So we need some decoys. So they had the perfect decoys, because when Dr. King was in jail, he had written this letter from a St. Augustine jail to a rabbi in New Jersey, urging him to recruit rabbis to come to St. Augustine. So here were 16 of America's most distinguished Reformed Jewish rabbis, and they were to be the decoys. They were going to go up. The Monson was this very long place, and they were going to go up by the restaurant and have a pray-in, and the manager of the Monson was a Baptist deacon, and he was having culture shock and cursing them and pushing them and demanding they be arrested. And then finally somebody said, "Oh, my God, look at the swimming pool." And there they were, black and white together, swimming there. And the manager of the motel, who was also the president of the Florida Hotel Motel Association, went and got acid and poured it in. And that, both the film footage of that and the still version of that are just embedded in American history.
David, right, the
reprinted
media
all
had
the
been
time.
notified. Come to the Monson that day. And so the media, national media, was out there. I don't know if they exactly knew what was going to happen, but they were there. And so all these cameras flashing and taking video of what was happening with the swimming pool. There are a lot more photos and videos of the swimming pool than of the rabbis praying, right? And so the swimming pool pictures then of the police officer jumping fully clothed into the swimming pool to stop what was happening, and then the acid being poured into that swimming pool. Those pictures were on the front pages, as you mentioned, across the world. And that was the linchpin for then what happened the next day, which was the vote for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It had been stalled in Congress. And that day, the next day, after the splash heard around the world, that day, that act was passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, directly, many people believe, directly tied to what happened in St. Augustine that day with a swimming pool. And the swimming pool is still there. It's in a different form and fashion, but it's still there. It's where the Hilton Hotel is right now.
I mean, having planned for the the press attention, inviting the press, Adonnica, surely they had anticipated that swimming would get attention, but nothing could have prepared, I think, anybody for the visual of that manager pouring acid in the pool with teenagers.
Yeah, that even when you think about it now, because you know what acid does to your skin, and the idea that he was that evil to do that he didn't want someone in the pool that much that you would harm them that way. And it really shows you how important it was that the citizens of St. Augustine took their stand. Because if you had just waited, then when would they still be allowed? Would they be able to be in a pool today? If we didn't make that stand, would I be able to do the things that I'm able to do freely if our leaders in St. Augustine, Jacksonville, and those across the country did not take the stand? And so the idea that you would harm someone like that, and you're a leader in the community, and you are a businessman, that you would hurt someone that way because they were in a pool, that means that you don't see them as a person, obviously, and you'd have no care for their life. And so that was the spark. That was what that was the equivalent of seeing the children in Birmingham being hosed down. That really gave the attention to the United States overall, to what was happening in the South.
To bring it back to Dr. King, he was not on the site of the motel, right?
He was across the street.
He was across the street, watching. And there's a little clip of video that still exists of him standing kind of, where the bayfront is, right there in St. Augustine, just north of Bridge of Lions, just watching. And to me, that's powerful because he and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had really helped orchestrate that drama that day, except unknowing that the acid thing was going to happen. But then King was across the street watching it. I mean, he was a big part of it, but only in planning, I think. Is that accurate, David, do you think?
I mean, they were just masterful in figuring out what would be new and different. So Dr. King had already been arrested there the week before, so he wasn't going to do the same thing over and over again. But what incredible time.
We're talking about Martin Luther King's history in St. Augustine and the movement there. We'd love to hear from you. Give us a call at 549-2937 or send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. And you can also reach out to us on social media. David, remind us what was happening also in St. Augustine at the time. It was the 400th anniversary. That proved to be a catalyst in some ways for the demonstrations that were occurring.
It does, because they had decided several years before. They saw, we have this 400th birthday coming up. We're the nation's oldest city. And we'll take the old downtown Main Street where you had Sears Roebuck and Western Auto and all these things. We'll tear all those places down and we'll build reproductions of what used to be there hundreds of years ago. And we'll have the biggest tourist success in history. I mean, they really felt like the most important question was, can we cram enough cash registers into town by 1965 to hold all this money? And they got the state legislature to pass an enabling law, and that should have been a dead giveaway, because that law says St. Augustine is the oldest community of the white race in America. And so, you could have predicted, maybe if you had wonderful foresight, that this would come into conflict with what else was happening in the country at the time. And so they were going to celebrate this. President Kennedy had appointed a national commission with people like Henry Ford II, an all-white commission. And all of this was going to be done by whites only. And this is where Dr. Haling became the most unpopular person in St. Augustine. He wrote and said, don't give these people any money. This is going to be an all-white celebration. It's a disgrace, not a triumph.
And remind us, Dr. Haling, he was a dentist in St. Augustine.
Dr. Haling was probably the most historically significant dentist in American history, not for tooth drilling, but because of his role in leading the St. Augustine movement that led to one of the two great laws of the civil rights era getting passed. So Dr. Haling is the one who first got beaten and brought here for his safety to Brewster Hospital in Jacksonville. And, in later years, Dr. Haling lived in Fort Lauderdale, but he would come to St. Augustine frequently. And one time he said, I'm so glad I did what I did back in 1964, because now when I make that long drive, I can stop and go to the bathroom. And I couldn't do that before the Civil Rights Law was passed.
Wow.
We've got a call. Shane calling from Mandarin. Good morning. Welcome to First Coast Connect.
Hey, how are you?
Very good. Go right ahead.
What I have to talk about is relevant, but I was born in a suburb of Detroit in 1960, and my dad had 9 brothers and sisters. They all worked for the automobile industry in Detroit, and we lived right across the highway in a suburb south of Detroit called Taylor. It's right where the Detroit airport is. And Dr. King, in 1966, I was in the first grade. My parents were active in the civil rights movement during that period of time. And so we went to the airport because Martin Luther King was coming. And he didn't give any kind of a speech or anything. He just got off the plane and shook people's hands and stuff. But my dad got a bumper sticker for the car that said, I have a dream. And he put it on the back of a brand new Tornado that we had. And that was in the winter of 1966 when I was in the first grade. But I got up the next morning and looked out the door, and the neighborhood we lived in was, all white. There was not any mixed. It was segregated area. But they had painted swastikas all over the car, which was a white car, with black spray paint, and the N-word, and all that stuff. But the reason I'm calling is because
Shane, I think we might have lost you there. Adonnica, obviously talking about a very intolerant time in American history where somebody's car would be vandalized because of an "I have had a dream" sticker.
Yeah, so that was, um, I can't even imagine living at that time. That your everyday life is that, and if you um stood up for the rights of everyone, especially African Americans, your life was in danger. It didn't matter. So it took a lot for what Dr. King, what Rutledge Pearson, and their families went through because of their decision to stand up for their rights. And even the young people, the four young ladies who were in jail because they stood up, they were part of the protest. That the idea that you wanting to preserve and protect your own life costs you your life. But if you were willing to take that risk, then it was worth it for you. And that's kind of what it is. If it's worth the struggle, the pain to get what you want, then you're going to go for it and be able to walk down the street and go to a bathroom, any bathroom. It was just time for them to they made that decision that it was worth it.
Jessica, people like Shane who have a direct connection to Martin Luther King, they're increasingly tenuous, people that have that kind of a story to tell. The number of sites that, he maybe was at in St. Augustine, those are also being torn down. David's done a lot of work to preserve the buildings and the sites that are left, but you've just recently been reporting on a house that it was a safe house.
Right. So David was the one who told me about this years ago. So it was going to be a safe house. It was going to be a place where Dr. King could go in Crescent Beach. And the house is still there, and it's a very humble-looking house amidst these very tall, big beach homes now. But Dr. King in 1964 was told, you can stay here. Well, it was printed in the paper where he was going to be staying. And so that night, it was shot up. Dr. King was not inside. But there are bullet holes still of the bullets that hit the home in a glass door in the back of the house. Well, over time, that house has changed ownership and hands. The latest couple to buy it bought it with the idea that they wanted to preserve it, but they wanted to build a bigger house around it. The neighbors did not like that. I mean, we're talking in the last couple of years. The latest decision now, according to St. Johns County and to the owners, I just spoke to them the other day, the house is going to be moved. They're going to pop it onto a trailer, literally move it down the street to Windswept Park, which is a park right on A1A in Crescent Beach. It's a county park. And it's going to be preserved at that park. What it's going to become and what will happen to it is unknown at this time, according to some county folks I'm talking to. But it is going to be preserved, and the owners of that nicely priced beachfront property they're going to build a new home on it.
That's news, right? I mean,
It's news. Breaking it right here, Ann.
Excellent.
Sorry, First Coast News.
That's all
It'll
right.
come up soon. But yeah, and so, it is
You're
still...
scooping yourself.
I know it. But there's still things like that happening in not just St. Augustine, but I'm sure many other places where there are ties and connections to either Dr. King or the Civil Rights Movement, where there's this idea of, well, is it going to just go by the wayside or is it going to be preserved? And my goodness sakes, I believe it is a grant that is paying for the moving of this house. It can't be cheap.
Mm-hmm.
David Nolan, there have been a lot of losses on that front and some victories in terms of saving that history. We actually got a call from someone who was trying to correct, saying that the swimming pool is no longer there. It's now a parking lot to the Hilton Hotel. Tell us about that, David, because you worked very hard to try to save the Monson, to save the pool where that swim-in occurred. What remains?
Well, this was about 25 years ago, and it was a great heartbreak because people said, oh, it's not historic, no history. And yet, this is the only place in Florida where Martin Luther King was arrested and the place where the famous photograph was and everything. So what we finally, in the end, they tore down the Monson and they dug up the ground there and they put our first underground parking garage and they built 18 or 19 fake colonial buildings on top, but they did save the steps from the restaurant where Dr. King had been arrested, so you can see them today. And they got rid of the swimming pool, but they put another swimming pool in that location, and there's a little historic marker next to it. And we took Al Lingo there, and he had his daughter with him, so that he was posing there kind of in the
so
same
that
geographic location, but not
so
the
the
same
pool is
physical pool.
I see. Is it in the same place?
More or less, yeah.
Okay. Huh. Okay. Well, I stand corrected. Thank you, sir.
Well, when Adonnica was talking earlier about the Ku Klux Klan rally where Dr. Haling and others were brutally beaten in 1963, the site of that Klan rally has just been purchased by the county for something like $18.5 million as a park. And I hope that when they name that park, they won't call it County Boat Ramp number 3. James Jackson, who was one of the people beaten, is still alive in St. Augustine, so let's take advantage of the places that we have that figured in our civil rights history.
Adonnica, you had told me a fact I didn't know just about, I knew that Dr. Haling had, attended a Klan rally and been caught, but I didn't realize how savagely he was beaten.
Yes, he his teeth were pulled out. He was beaten really bad, and supporters here in Jacksonville, they brought him here. They whisked him away and brought him here to Jacksonville and guarded him while he healed here at Brewster Hospital. But he was guarded. But yes, he was brutally. But he and his family were constantly shot at or attacked. Their home was shot at so many times. Even when his wife was pregnant with one of their children, and they're sitting at home and bullets coming flying through the home, you really have to be committed to. They really, and I'm really grateful to him. And I had a chance to meet him and talk with him. He was a great guy. I'm really grateful to him and Rutledge Pearson and others. I really am, because they put their life on the line for me to do what I'm doing today. Who knows if I would be able to do what I do today without what they did. And so I would like to think that I would have enough guts to fight for but I don't have to do that. So what I do is take what they did, and I stop belly aching and complaining. When I want to complain, I think about that, and I really do. And I think about that, and of course, the joy of my life is that I am a historian. So I talk about people like him and the everyday person that, the women that worked in homes of white people to raise their own kids as well raising their kids, the white family's children. So it was a real commitment, and for us not to know these stories is unfortunate, is a shame, but that's what my job is, to make you aware of this information and encourage you to learn it. It's not about making you ashamed. It's about letting you see how strong these people were, because really, would you be willing to sacrifice your life and your family to make sure you and others coming behind you can have a great quality of life?
Well, thank you for all the work that you do, Adonnica Toler, David Nolan, Jessica Clark. Jessica Clark is going to be joining us on the second Monday of every month to talk some history in St. Augustine. So we look forward to that.
Fun stuff.
Thanks for all of you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.